Glad that you're here. If you'll go ahead and turn in your Bible to Psalm 18, and this is where we're going to start tonight. Psalm 18. So we've been in this discussion using our Sunday night just kind of as a time to put everything concerning Jesus' second coming and what eternity will be and what the New Testament has revealed. And taking it and putting it under the microscope and looking at different aspects of this and considering things. So last week I told you we would look at Matthew 24, and we will do that, but we'll do that in conjunction with a few things from the book of Revelation. So what we're going to do is look at judgment and look at what that event entails, what the Scripture has to say about it. We'll probably be here tonight. And then in 2 weeks, we'll pick back up with what we don't finish, because just as a reminder, next Sunday night is our singing night. And we'll also have the finger foods and things like that. So everybody make plans for that, but that is next Sunday night. So whatever we don't finish here tonight, we'll pick back up in 2 weeks for that. But God's character and God's judgment, if you will. And we're going to look at this, keep it exhaustive, so we're going to go a little slower with this, a little bit more questions, but just as God's character, both testaments, give me some characteristics of God. Love, unchanging, holy, good, righteous, just. Okay, He trusts. All right, what else? Loyal, almighty, all-powerful. All right, what else can you think of? Patient, kind, steadfast love. There are all sorts of things that come in there. Holy, pure, just, right, good, true, love. These are just some. That's not an exhaustive list. And the thing that is a struggling aspect for a lot of us is how does all of that mix, if you will, and judgment? How does that work with judgment? Because we come across with judgment as harsh, it's not loving, it's not kind, whatever it may be. But the way the Scriptures portray judgment is that God's judgment is founded on all of these characteristics and more. So, for example, I'm going to ask a question. So, Bob, you mentioned God is love. How is judgment? How do you reconcile judgment and love? Okay? All right. Sure. Sure. Okay. So judgment is a form of love. And even if you take what Paul does in 1 Corinthians 13 by inspiration of the Spirit, one aspect of love is that it does not rejoice in wrongdoing. That is one extension. That's the myth of today, that love doesn't do these types of things. And yet sometimes the most loving thing to do is to hold someone or to hold something accountable, if you will. And that's what judgment is. So David, you mentioned good. How do you reconcile good and judgment in the same? Okay, all right, so there is a standard, there is a level from good. So good isn't just something as far as food tastes good. It's not just subjective, but goodness in Scripture is objective to a certain extent as well. And there's a standard that He set. That standard we would call holiness, we would call purity. So those are just some examples to try to get us to reconcile, because we would look at judgment and kind of think, that isn't quite square. That's one of the things that our modern world struggles with. And yet, you mentioned just a second ago, we've been on this kick for about 5, 6, 7, 8 years. We want a good and just society. We want this, we want that. Great admiration. Maybe we're not exactly how we want to get there, but nonetheless a good goal. But if you want justice in terms of biblical justice, you want a God bring that. And judgment is a way of bringing a good and just, not a society, but in eternity, if that makes sense. I'm kind of dealing that in a nutshell. in that regard. So I want to look at Psalm 18 just to begin with, and then we'll backtrack a couple of books, if you will. So a volunteer, just somebody to read Psalm 18 and verses 25 through 30 for me. Whoever wants to go first, you can read that for me. So Psalm, do you want to read that? Okay, go ahead. 25 through 30, if you'll speak up where everybody can hear you.
Oh, you will show yourself merciful. With the blameless man you will show yourself sinless. With the pure you will show yourself pure, And with the devil and the devious you will show yourself shrewd. You will save the humble people, but bring down haughty looks. You will light up my lamp. The Lord my God will enlighten my darkness. For by you I can run against a troop, but my God I can leap over a wall.
In verse 30.
Right.
Thank you.
For God, his way is perfect. The way of the Lord is proven. Right. He is a shield to all who trust in him.
All right, thank you, Bud, for reading that for us. And what I wanted to focus on with this is that it just gives us all kinds of characteristics, how God deals with man, how he deals with humanity. But I wanted to look at, as a point of emphasis, as a launching pad for us tonight, is verse 30, and this is how the English Standard Version, this God, his way is perfect, and the word of the Lord proves true. If he is perfect in love, if he is perfect in holiness, if he's perfect in righteousness, if he's perfect in goodness, then when it comes to judgment, what will he be in? He will be perfect, right? And that's kind of where we're going as we head down this path. That's kind of what I want you to think of. So judgment from an Old Testament perspective. And this is something that Judaism didn't really have a very well-developed thought as far as heaven, hell. They had Sheol, they had Hades, but there really wasn't a real developed thought. There may have been some of Solomon in the ether trying to deal with stuff. Maybe his wisdom gave him some aspect of that. But as far as heaven, hell, they didn't really have much of a developed thing. But judgment, there was a very rich and deep theology. There was really a deep doctrine of judgment. So the first time we come across God having judgment against anybody, as far as a scale is concerned, is in Genesis 15, verses 13 and 14. God makes a covenant with Abraham, and he tells him, now you're going to have offspring, and they're going to go to a nation, and they're going to be subjected. And they will be subjected, they will be enslaved for 400 years. And God essentially tells Abraham, when the time comes and I save them, I will also bring judgment against them. That's the first time, really the first time where we have God holding people or holding a group, holding a nation, if you will, accountable. And I'm using that word accountable a lot because I'm trying to do it synonymously. Why is it important, based on God's characteristics, that he holds everyone accountable? Okay, Bob? Okay, that's the only way he can be a just God. So go a little bit further then. Why can't he just love people? Why, in terms of accountability? Why hold and make, whether it's a nation or as we see it developed, individuals, why hold accountability? Okay. Okay, so being honest, Jeff? Sure. Sure. Okay, it requires accountability and even somebody greater than the Egyptians who are doing or committing the wrong. I think, Dennis, you were raising. Okay. Sure. It will, because we impact others. But you're right. So if you need to hear, Dennis, it's almost two extremes. If we're allowed as individuals or just as nations or the whole world to a certain extent just to do what we want, we've already proven we will go away. See, Adam and Eve, we'll prove that. Even in perfection, we'll do that. But the other is, if you follow, Brian mentioned this in the morning, if you humble yourself and you submit, there's blessing to be found and promise and so forth and so on. So this is the first full time that we see this. Job 22 and verse 4. There's a lot that goes in with Job. I understand the poetry, perhaps even a parable. And we look at the friends and kind of say, well, you know, they how dare they would have spoken. It's not that they didn't speak truth. It's just that they had assumed that Job, that was where their sin was. But we don't need to throw the baby out with the wash. And there's a statement that's made in Job 22:4 about God's judgment and what he will do. Now, they're assuming Job had sinned because, hey, if things are going well in your life, God's blessed you. If things are going wrong in your life, God's punishing you. And we have that same thought. You know, why is God doing this to me? We have that same thought. I must have done something bad. That's not the thought. But that was how it approached. But there's some truth in the fact that God does allow things to happen. You reap what you sow to a certain extent in that. Psalm 75 is an entire psalm about God's righteous judgment and who he is and how it flows from his character. He's not arbitrary with it. He's not whimsical with it. Scott mentioned this morning, they're getting tired of their pagan gods. Just kind of this whimsicalness with it that we just quite can't, they're just doing whatever. They're just playing games. Yahweh is not that way. He is not whimsical in anything. Again, his way is perfect and his way is true. So let's turn to Ecclesiastes 12. This is perhaps the full thought process as we go with God throughout the Old Testament, where he moves from kind of a macro to a micro. I get a nation. You know, Jeff mentioned this a minute ago. He's righting the wrongs, if you will, setting the order back in balance. And I can get that from a nation perspective. I can get that from a world perspective. What about individuals? And when you get to the book of Ecclesiastes, the way that we treat that book, you would think that the ending is verse 13. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. We quote that, you would think that that's the very last verse of the last chapter, but there's one more verse, isn't there? Somebody read that verse for me. Somebody read verse 14. Okay, that right there, it's a bookend to the book. If you want to frame the book of Ecclesiastes, what is wisdom? Wisdom is God. Obviously, that's where Solomon begins. But the second part of living a wise life is just know, to a certain extent, because of free will and choice, you can go do what you want. If you want to chase money, if you want to chase pleasure, if you want to chase book wisdom, if you want to chase whatever, that is well within your free scope. That is fine. And if you want people to know that's what you're chasing, that's fine. And if you want to keep it a secret, that's fine. Just know something. Just know something. At the end, whenever that may be, that God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether it's good or evil. You want to live a wise life? Obviously start with God, start with his word, but just in the back of your mind, just know, if you don't want to listen to Solomon and take his advice and allow him to experiment for you, you want to do the experimenting, that's fine. Just know there is nothing that we will partake in, no matter how closely of a secret it is guarded, that we will keep and take to the grave. That's just something. You want wisdom. That's how this book ends. It doesn't end with fear God and keep his commandments. It ends with, just know, it's the back of your mind. If you don't want to fear him, you got that choice. But just know, this is what he'll do. And again, it's not because he's sadistic. It's not because he loves punishing people. It's not because he loves seeing people squirm in their seats. He's not because he loves the fact that we're scared half to death of what's coming down the line. That's not it at all. If he doesn't do it, though, he is not unchanging them. He is consistent. And that's one of the biggest things. Why does he hold accountability, whether in the macro or the micro? Because he is consistent in all of his ways. Go ahead, Scott. Good point. Yes. Right. Right. And we're not even to just live unto ourselves either. Because you're right, if you do, then your purpose, humanity's purpose, goes unfulfilled, which is the glory and honor, just like the rest of the created order. We are to do what the rest of the created order, to declare his handiwork, to show forth his glory and all of those things. But the difference is we're allowed the choice. The sun does not get a choice on whether it shines or not. The moon doesn't get a choice on whether it reflects or not. But man gets a choice to follow or not. Go ahead. He will. He will. And again, it won't be like ours, where we would even be imbalanced and partial with our judgment when we want to give it. And we're going to see Jesus mention that in the New Testament. But you're right. When something, to take what Jeff mentioned a minute ago, when Egypt is doing wrong to Israel, God swoops in and rights the wrong. Judgment serves as a righting of the wrong. And ultimately, the wrong is sin. So that's what judgment is. If there's no judgment, there is no justice, and there is no righting what sin has warped and corrupted. Judgment's about removing sin from all of creation. And that's really where we're at with that. So, Jack, you were raising your hand a second ago. Right. You will. Bailey, were you raising your hand? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And right. And what a loving way he does it, from that. Because it's, I want to right the wrong now. Let's do it today and not on the fixed day, as we're going to see the New Testament speak about. So that's a great way to be able to frame it. If we're having a discussion with someone that's not a believer, maybe experimenting, someone who's considering it, but it is an obstacle, and make no mistake that God and judgment are an obstacle for several. How does loving God do all of these things? You would want that. If you've ever suffered any sort of injustice on a personal level, or we see it on society, you want somebody bigger and more powerful. Laurel mentioned this, almighty, to be able to right that and put it back in harmony. Shalom. Put it back. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. hmm and the thing about the judgment, so I'm going to segue into that. The thing about judgment, whether it's Old or New Testament, is God is judging the sin that is creating whatever's wrong. Why did Egypt subject somebody else? Why does anybody, why did Cain murder his brother? Right? All these things that are going on, judgment and accountability is saying we're going to judge the very heartbeat of what's wrong. And the heartbeat of what's wrong around us today and then and now, is sin. That's what's wrong. So even the day of judgment that we're going to look at is all about eliminating and eradicating sin from all of the created order. But here's the thing, and this is why I heard somebody mention this, Timothy Keller mentioned this. This is why God gives us another day. This is why his patience extends. You know, God is patient toward you, not willing that any should perish. Because what's in me? If I am not in Christ, what is in me? Sin. Which means that if I die outside of Christ and I meet the Lord and I understand that judgment is about judging the heartbeat of what's wrong, and I've got sin in me, the heartbeat of what's wrong with my life is sin. So what will he do? He will judge sin, but he will also judge me in that sin, which is why I'm lost. But if I go to Christ and I put myself in him, faith, trust, repentance, baptism, so forth and so on, what does God see? Does he see sin? What does he see? He sees his son. That's why you are clothed with him. So Bailey mentioned this in terms of confidence. We'll see a New Testament text will tell us in 1 John that even on that day, you can have confidence. But it's not confidence in me. It's the one who covers me. But that's the idea. So why is God long-suffering? Why is God patient? Because he's not willing that any should be lost in their sin. Because he knows what he's going to do to sin. And how do I know he's going to do that? Cain, Egypt, Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, David, the list goes on and on and on. What makes me think any different? So let's look at the New Testament and a couple of things that are mentioned. So the New Testament speaks of judgment. Again, remember Christianity. The Way comes in and teaches that history is linear. There is a beginning and there is an end. Time, it's linear. We are not circular. What comes around goes around. That does not exist. It's linear. Now, if I keep making the same decision, then sure, I can create a loop. But time is linear. There's a start and there is an end. The Hebrew writer mentions this, and we talked about it at the very beginning when we mentioned death, that there are two realities. Either we pass or Jesus returns. In the sequence is it, and I'm sure you can quote it, there is appointed for man to die one time, and then after that, the judgment. Now, we don't know whether that judgment is instantaneous or whether it's all, one big event. It seems to lend itself that it's one big event. Everybody's going to be there. But it is a day. And this is what I think, David, I think you mentioned in your communion thoughts, Acts 17. We want to learn more about the resurrection. It's interesting that sermon to a group of philosophers doesn't end with a philosophy. It ends with, and God has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness. And of whom he has given account, he has set in stone, Elisha's phrase, by raising him from the dead. How do you and I know that there is a fixed day on which God will hold the entire world, one at a time, past, present, and future, accountable? Because there was a time long ago on a fixed day that he brought forth Jesus from the grave. Christianity is based on fixed days. He was born of a woman, born under the law, the right time. He died. Third day he was resurrected. There are fixed days along the way. Christianity has that. And then Acts 24 speaks of the expectation. So let's look at Acts 24. Just something, and I know, Kevin, you and your group, your class read through this. But this sermon, well, I say this sermon, I guess you can say this exchange between Paul and Felix has always intrigued me. Because if you had one opportunity, the governor of our state calls you and says, I got an appointment with you, and you have my full and undivided attention to talk about your faith, and you got 1 hour, what are you talking about? Because that's essentially what Paul has. Now, he has several days, I understand that, but just bear with me. And it's the fact of what he includes in this conversation with Felix is always intrigued me. Because I wonder if I would do the same. I wonder if I would include these things as well. So can I have a volunteer? Acts 24, verses 22 through 27. Grace, if you can read those for us, and if you'll read loud, please. Acts 24, 22 through 27. Thank you very much for reading that. So we get the idea. We know why Felix ultimately drug everything out. He wants money. So that's what Brian mentioned in terms of the bribes and whatever else. If I can get something out of you, that's fine. So we know his ulterior motive. But if you're Paul, are you talking about righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment, or are you talking about something else? If you're in his shoes, you got a few minutes, maybe an hour, who knows. You don't know if it's your first or last. What about the Christian way? Or what are you talking about? It would, wouldn't it? The pull would be love and forgiveness. What else? Okay, it's what gets me out, because I can do a lot more good out than I can with these chains. So maybe, like you said, if you didn't hear what David said, maybe I'll touch on a little bit about that. But for the most part, I'm here unjust. I'm a Roman citizen. You're doing all the wrong things. Let me go. I'm not here to do any type of stuff. Let me be kind of what you were talking about. He would be a pre-Justin martyr. Hey, I'm not here to create trouble. I'm just doing this. He did. And if the way I do it is as a prisoner, I'll do it. So, obviously, the promotion of the gospel is the biggest part of this. But why those three things then? Why righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment? Okay. Yeah. And he'll tell the Corinthians that later on. Why are you judging me? There's only one that'll do it. And almost to a certain extent, Rachel, what you said a minute ago, Paul almost seemed to have adopted that mindset. I'm not going to worry about whether I get out or not. Because I know, tying into your part, Bailey, I know in my heart, and I know he knows my heart. I know he knows all of those things. I'm not here to discuss me, though that would be the temptation. I'm not even here to discuss love and forgiveness. It's almost as if he enters the political arena and uses the language that Felix would have understood and grasped. So go ahead, babe. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Right. Right. No, I agree. And the other thing is on this fixed day, the roles. So if you're Felix, Paul, if you're right, the roles will be reversed. That's the other thing about that, is that there will not be me sitting and deciding the case. It will be me standing, and you, or this God that you're proclaiming, will be the one who decides the case. And what are the criteria that he decides based on? Righteousness and self-control. And Felix would get that because somebody who would have come to him was there because they were unrighteous and or they had lost control of whatever. So he gets it in those terms, which means whomever we're talking to on an individual basis, because we're supposed to, you should know your person and you should know the language. So what Andy mentioned, there is a time and a place for love, grace, mercy, and forgiveness with an individual. And there's also a time and a place to be able to say at the same time, there's an expectation of something coming down the line for everybody. Everybody. It's coming. Everybody will be there. And the roles will all be reversed. So, Jeff, you mentioned Egypt. Egypt, you can do whatever you want for 400 years to whomever you want. Just know the day comes when the roles are reversed. And if you're found opposing God, there's not much left standing. Go ahead, Tom. Right? That's the other thing. Yes. He will be. Yeah, whatever Paul said, we're just told topics, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it. So Paul could have developed all of these thoughts. He could have done it over the course of however many times he appeared. Either way, he did get a reaction from Felix. What is Felix's reaction? He grows alarmed. But the pull of money is more powerful than the pull of alarm. So, I mean, that's still fascinating to me that at the beginning he grows alarmed, but not enough to stop wanting Paul to pay him a little bit of money to get him free, which means that the coming judgment and the discussion of eternity of heaven and hell may not work what we think it will work. May not. Doesn't mean that it's not spoken, But it may not be enough to move the needle completely in the way that we would think. Go ahead. He did. It would be. And isn't it amazing that you can have that tone even about something as difficult as a coming judgment and still maintain an open door? I could still talk about the truth of a coming judgment or eternity or whatever it is, but not berate somebody so much that it just completely closes the door. So that's a great, great observation with that. So 2 weeks, this is what we're going to do. We're going to look at Jesus, and we're going to look at the role. So I'll go ahead and pull these up. If you want to take a picture, you can. What's fascinating about all of this, and I mentioned this from Acts 17, that righteousness and self-control are the criteria. What the New Testament develops is that Jesus becomes the criteria. Jesus is it. And where Yahweh in the Old Testament is the one who brings judgment and pronounces sentencing, for lack of a better way of putting it, it is now the Son's responsibility. So when we get there to the day, on that fixed day, the Son will be judge and the Son will be advocate. You want to sit with something, how can you be in two places at once? Well, the Son will be there. He will be the judgment seat of Christ, is how Paul will describe it. And in other places, though, he will be your advocate. Now, how that works, I don't know. That'll be up to them. I just want him to be the advocate. And that's the point. The point of whether it was Felix, whether it is Cornelius later on or early on, or it's me or you, history is linear. And the words of Solomon echo into the New Testament. Fear God and keep his commandments. But if you choose to do things on your own terms, God has given you that freedom. God has given me that freedom. Just know, whatever you pursue, whatever it is, even if it is your heart's desire, and you've never shared it with anybody, just know he will bring it out in the open, and he will judge and hold us accountable for that. That is why we emphasize so much Jesus. Because our heart, truly revealed, is a lot darker than what we would ever imagine. Which is why the goodness and the sacrifice of Jesus is even deeper than the greatest darkness that we have. That's why everything points to him. So we'll pick up here next week. 2 weeks, excuse me. In 2 weeks. Next week is our singing night. So in 2 weeks, so you got 2 weeks to kind of look at this. Again, this is not exhaustive, but we're looking at what the New Testament has to say about these. We're going to slow down and read through this, and we got a couple of other slides as well. So 2 prayer requests, and then we'll close. If you have not partaken of communion, please go to the hallway to my right, your left, and someone will meet you there in room 14, and there you can partake of it together. But we got a note from Gary.